I want to introduce the founding and the director of the Popola Project, an amazing linguist who's thinking about language revitalization for the Pacific, for Black folks, for, just an amazing linguist. I mean, when I say linguist, I mean PhD linguist, all right? You know what I mean? Because we get educated. That's what we do. But also just someone that I truly and deeply admire and also feel like we've known each other for lifetimes, Dr. Kemi Glenn.
Aloha, everybody.
Aloha.
It's so great to see a full house tonight. This is gorgeous. It's really nice to see all of you in the dark. I'm going to ask our panelists to come up, and once we get on the stage, I'll introduce our panelists for the evening, and we'll start some conversation.
I didn't do it. It's like the Bill Duke scene.
All right, we have some great folks on the stage with us tonight. I'm going to give them a short little bio, but if you Google any of these folks, you'll find lots more about the amazing work that they do as scholars, as community workers, as artists, as creative people. And we're really, really lucky to have them for this conversation tonight, thinking about what Black futures and Hawaiian futures have to say to each other, and kind of using this film, the kind of buzz around Wakanda Forever and Black Panther to think about what it actually means for us to start to not only wish for better futures, more just futures for our peoples, but to really start to visualize what that looks like on a large scale. So next to me is David A.M. Goldberg. He is an accomplished Hawaii-based writer, teacher, programmer, and media developer who has used a lifelong interest in art, culture, and technology to transform the means by which people access, assess, and organize knowledge. Currently, David writes art and culture pieces for the Honolulu Star-Advertiser and programs and manages local and mainland web development projects. He teaches in the Department of American Studies at the University of Hawaiʻi and also develops curriculum. So let's welcome David. And next to David is my dear friend Prentice Hemphill. Prentice is a healer, somatics practitioner, teacher, writer, and organizer who works at the intersections of healing and justice. As the former Healing Justice Director at Black Lives Matter, Prentice committed to supporting and nurturing the brilliant strategies of organizers and healers to address trauma, move through conflict, and center wholeness in the Black Lives Matter network and in the broader movement for Black freedom and liberation. Prentice is committed to transformation on the cellular level and the belief that who we are and how we are in our most intimate spaces is vital for our collective liberation. Let's welcome Prentice. And last but not least is Noelani Goodyear-Ka'ōpua, daughter of the ocean, Kanaka Maoli, mother of three, an associate professor of political science at the University of Hawaiʻi at Mānoa. Her research focuses on Indigenous and Native Hawaiian politics with an emphasis on education, social movements, Indigenous resurgence, and Indigenous futures. In addition to her publications and research, Noe is an award-winning teacher at UH Mānoa and a dedicated volunteer in the Hawaiian community. She serves on boards of Hawaiian community organizations doing land and ocean-based cultural resurgence work, as well as on the Executive Council of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. She was born and raised on Oahu, and her genealogy also connects her to other islands within the Hawaiian archipelago, as well to southern China and the British Midlands. Let's welcome Noe. So as you can see, we have a really wonderful panel tonight who have really diverse kinds of experience in thinking about futures and healing and the past and our genealogies. So I'd like to open up with a question to each of you, kind of to set the stage for tonight, and that is, what is the future? What is futurism? And why is it something that is worthwhile for us to engage in imagining futures for our peoples? Anybody?
Your land.
Aloha kako. Well, I like to think about futures in the plural, that there isn't a single future, that the futures are open. And as Lili Kalakame'elehiva has written in her important work on Native Land and Foreign Desires, one of the ways that we think about the futures from a Kanaka perspective is the time that is rather than sort of in front of us, it's the time that's behind us, that it's the past that we can see, and that we're moving back into the potential futures. But I also wanted to kind of trouble the binary between past and futures, because I think it's really important that our peoples think about things cyclically, and that a lot of the work to reclaim our past, our deep past, is also about the ability to reclaim our imagination of deep futures. So I think I'll just start there.
I think for me, so much of what you're saying is still stirring in me, actually. But I think about how we are existing in someone else's kind of imagined state right now. The way everything's constructed, like if we really look at it, we're inside of someone else's imagination about how we should sit, how big or tall we should be to sit in the chair that we're sitting in, how tall you need to be to come through the door, what it means to sit and witness something. All of this emerges out of someone's imagination, and I think for communities and folks who are liberating themselves from a history of colonization, are often living inside of an imagination that doesn't recognize us and doesn't recognize our imaginative potential, doesn't recognize the depth of our relationships or understand the meaning of our lives. And so for me, futurism, our communities declaring a future, is critically important to us figuring out piece by piece a sort of path towards liberation. We have to declare, we have to imagine a future outside of the one that's been kind of given to us, that doesn't actually really include us, makes us sort of machines or sort of subjects, essentially, that kind of act out someone else's future. So how do we declare something that's more just, that has more room for our lives, for the experience of our lives, for our healing, for our embodiment? It's what I think of with futurism.
Yeah. I mean, there's no future. This is it, right? I mean, it's what we remember. There's what we can hope for. I think that's valid. But what Prentice was just saying about us existing inside constructs that other people have set forth from us, I think is like the first place to start looking. Which doesn't mean that there is no hope and there's no way to move through the present. But the idea of futurism, I mean, even the ism part of it makes me nervous, right? So I think about all the isms and the ideology that goes with that. So I use the word to have conversations, but I often try to, by the time I'm done talking about it, erase the word so that people recognize that what we're really trying to build is very active, vibrant presence that are taking into account as much as we can about what we see and what we know and what we bring to any given moment. So I think, especially as someone who's not born here, who has been blessed by Hawaii, I'm always thinking about the present nourishment that I get from the community and the land and the air that takes me forward, and not about that future out there. Plus, even the word comes from, Italian fascists messing around with art and explosions and machines. And that, what they were trying to do was valid, because they were actually trying to blow up certain Western sensibilities with futurism. But we have to be careful about the language that we appropriate.
I think that piece that you just mentioned around kind of being in the present, and also Noe talking about the cyclical nature of our existence and being connected to our ancestors as well as to the future. I'm curious if the three of you could talk a little bit about your own practices. I introduced you as scholars and activists and healers and artists, and I wonder if you could talk about how your practices, whatever those may be, kind of dialogue with that idea of the cyclical nature, thinking about the future.
I mean, my current PhD research is actually trying to figure out what is it about certain formations in American culture that are repeating themselves. So I'm looking at the fact that emancipation was not emancipatory for Black people, and wondering if there's not just a poetic resonance, but a systemic connection between that and how we feel about social media and contemporary technology. So I'm actually thinking about this question of, are we in these conditions of digital emancipation where we're said we're being freed by this technology, but in reality we're not? So for me, it's a very active question, right? The idea of how do we think about the technology around us? How do we think about the social relationship that the technology is transforming? And then how do I relate that back to the reality of the past that I live as I try to raise, a Hapa Filipino 14-year-old in Hawaii with folks back in California and trying to stay connected to those loops. So for me, my practice it's about looking at now as closely as I can, but being cognizant of the fact that the past does not ever die, and it's constantly informing the present.
I think about healing, and I say that word, it's a word I talk about a lot, I think about a lot, and a lot of times I feel like I don't even know what it means yet. I don't really quite understand it yet, but it kind of moves me forward. I think about healing and I think about trauma, so those are some of the places where I do a lot of my work, and I think about trauma not in the ways that we are kind of offered it, particularly through kind of Western understandings, but as a real interruption in time. It's one of the things I talk about, because the way it plays out when something happens to us that deeply transforms us, a lot of times there's a part of us that gets left in that time. So past is future, future is past, it's all happening at once. So there's a way that I really look at the healing of trauma as sort of bringing your spirit to now, or current, or present as possible, into your choice, into your agency. And it's about a future. I think about the film, The Black Panther. I watched it last night. There may be some spoilers, and I'm sorry. I watched it already. But to me, the effort there is about healing some part of our imagination that has gotten sort of fixed or stuck in a particular place. It's shaking us loose and saying, hey, there's more here, there's more available, there's something different than what you thought, which I think is an effort towards our healing, really. So I think about healing, I think about trauma, I think about recovering parts of ourselves in time, and that's always still accessible to us. I mean, I deeply feel like I'm able to heal things that have happened to my ancestors in my body now. So think about the way time moves through us, the way we get stuck, and the way ultimately we can sort of heal, recover, and then change what happens next once we do that.
So I'm an educator. I teach in Indigenous studies, Indigenous politics, and Native Hawaiian politics. But I feel like a lot of the work that I do as an educator has been about trying to help particularly Kanaka Maoli, but other students as well that I encounter, to resituate themselves in their genealogies, which so often have been taken from us or hidden from us, in various ways. One of the things that one of the usurpers, when the beginning of the American occupation began here in Hawaii, said that the first thing we need to do is obliterate the past to sever our connection with our understandings of the genealogies that have come before us. So I feel like a lot of the work is there. And in terms of the topic of the panel tonight, I've been really interested in how our genealogies connect, how genealogies of peoples who are coming out of the African diaspora and Kanaka Maoli connect. And I am kind of encountering these things in a couple of ways. So one of the things that I study is Native Hawaiian social movements, particularly the sovereignty and demilitarization movements that began in the 1970s and have continued on to now. And all of the folks who I consider to be really important mentors for me were very much inspired by Black liberation movements and Black cultural production that went along with those movements. So for example, I've been working on an oral history project with an amazing woman, Auntie Terry Keko'olani, who talks about how one of the first books that really kind of sparked her consciousness was Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice. And it was right at the time when she was getting involved in a lot of anti-Vietnam War activism. I think about Papa Soli Neheu, who was a really important figure in our independence movement, who has written and talked about how he was influenced by work with the Black Panthers in the San Jose area. And then I think about one of my teachers, Kumuhona Nike Trask, who introduced us to all kinds of amazing writing and oratory by different Black folks. So one of the things I brought right at the top of my things to read was Frantz Fanon, who, as you all know, was involved with the struggle for Algerian independence. And so this is just kind of one of those pieces that she introduced to us, yeah. So he writes, "The claim to a national culture in the past does not only rehabilitate that nation and serve as a justification for the hope of a future national culture. In the sphere of psychoaffective equilibrium, it is responsible for an important change in the native. Perhaps we haven't sufficiently demonstrated that colonialism is not satisfied merely with holding a people in its grip and emptying the native's brain of all form and content. By a kind of perverted logic, it turns to the past of the oppressed people and distorts, disfigures, and destroys it." And so I think this is related to what Prentice was saying about how this impacts our ability to imagine futures, and this is why Black Panther is such an exciting moment for us to think about, reactivating that. So studying sort of the past of our social movements and engaging in them has been one part of my practice. And then the other part is that I've been teaching a course called Decolonial Futures for the last several years. And when I think back to the very first time I taught this course, the first book that we read was Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. Because I'm really not a sci-fi or comics nerd, I think David is. But I was really introduced to the joys of science fiction from Octavia Butler's work because it just was something totally different that I had never been exposed to, because we were exposed to sort of the, white stream science fiction. And it was interesting because one of the comments from the students in that class that I've thought about for a long time after this is, why are we reading this novel by an African-American writer in a class that's in Indigenous politics on decolonial futures? And the fact that people couldn't, there was that gap, I think, is one of the gaps that we're trying to bridge with this conversation, that people already see that there's a separation there. So my interest in futures and futurisms in terms of science fiction, not only in writing, but also all of the art and music that goes along with it, is I think indebted to Afro-Futurism, which I'm not an expert of and know just bits, and mostly, Octavia Butler's work has been the most influential for me. But that whole field has also really impacted the growth of Indigenous futurisms. And so that's a really important part of the genealogy of Indigenous futurisms today is, indebted to the creatives who have birthed Afro-Futurism as a field.
Sorry.
Okay. So that last piece, as you were sharing kind of about your practice as an educator around decolonization and imagining, I wonder if you folks could talk to us a little bit about how the experience of colonization looms in how we think about futures, the way we talk about them, what we're imagining, and also possibly touch on the idea of nostalgia for us, for our peoples before we were colonized, and how that might factor into especially some of the art and visuals that we see coming out in Afro-Futurism, Afro-Futurist work.
That escaping the colonial mentality that is trying to destroy your past or control it. Because even now, when you think about as we walk through the streets and our cell phones tell the system where we are at all times, that's the control of your past. Because at any moment, they can look 3 seconds into your past and determine what you were doing and feed you advertisements and things like that. So this notion of how deeply we exist in the colonial space and how the control and destruction of the past is still the operative paradigm, right? So in some sense, the idea of nostalgia is a natural, almost a natural response to say like, well, let me just imagine a better time, right? And I think that can be productive and really fruitful so long as you're conscious of how you're using it. You know what I mean? I think this notion of questioning the imagination is at the core, right? Like our imagination is the root of all of this, right? Like the ability to imagine is the one thing that cannot be ultimately controlled. For me, that's the futurism, that's the decolonization, is the fact that, you know, in this space of commerce and capitalism, these artists were allowed to create something, you know, so don't put all your faith in the film, you know, look up all those people in the credits, right? And what story would we tell about them? You know, like that's the story, right? That's the inspiration.
Now, it's interesting because when you asked that question, the first two things I thought about were the FBI's classification of Black identity extremists. And as someone that's been, you know, working with Black Lives Matter for a while, that was obviously something to pay attention to. But again, talking about cycles. So the criminalizing identifying as yourself, and that there's something inherently dangerous inside of identifying too strongly as a Black person or with Black culture. And then I was thinking about living here and sort of the criminalization of language and the way we are seeing like Hawaiian language, again, cyclically criminalized. And just like feeling for how dangerous it can be to hold on to who you are and who you have been, and how that gets criminalized is one thing I was thinking of. It's not even just sort of abstract, you know, pulling you away from yourself, but it's like actually deeply criminal to sort of engage with your culture and who you are. Over the holiday season, I was in the office supply store, and like Bing Crosby was playing, and all those like, you know, those Christmas carols that they play, and I was like singing, and I was like, oh, the good old days of Christmas time. Wait a minute. That's not actually my memory that has like been implanted in my brain. Like those like white Christmas snowy, I don't have that memory. That's not an actual memory of mine. The 50s and Bing Crosby was singing and everything was nice. I don't have that. So nostalgia is an interesting thing. And we see that in sort of the Make America Great Again. It's like, whose nostalgia are we inside of? One, is important for us to recognize. Are you even a part of that memory? Like, Bing Crosby wasn't checking for you. And I think our roots, our culture, our indigenous practices have always pointed to a way of being with past, where we're able to sort of wrestle with it and get the lessons from it and sort of keep bringing imagination and change to our practices. I think about sort of a practice that has influenced me, though it's a Ghanaian practice of thinking about Sankofa, like going back and fetching it, going back and getting understanding to inform the present. So it's never without, and I think sometimes we think about, like you were saying, this dichotomy, past or present, when it's like, how do we move with it all? And not necessarily, though I think sometimes it is useful and can be healing to engage in sort of a romance around your past, especially when so much has been taken from you and you've been taught to see it as wrong or bad or all of these things. To have a period of being like, no, this is actually really beautiful. When I watched Black Panther yesterday, I was like, Black people are the most beautiful people that you will ever see in your life. We do the most beautiful things. I was having that feeling, and I still stand by it today. I was like, we are amazing. And how do I enter into the past that's alive with me, that's alive with us, and allow myself to be creative, to be spontaneous, to be generative now in response to sort of the current conditions, landscape, all of that. So I think it's more of a question. It's more, you just try things and see what happens. And I think, always looking at whose nostalgia am I inside of, how do I generate love for what is mine, and how do I also keep moving forward and keep creating so that there's liberation now.
I guess where I was going in my head first with the question was thinking about how it's such an old colonial trope to relegate Indigenous people to the past, that we don't have a future, that we are, quickly becoming irrelevant, and that there's this progressive narrative that is a highly technological one, highly militarized, and I flashed on a comic that was published in 2015, right around the time when all of the arrests were happening on Mauna Kea, which showed, it was just two squares, and the first panel said the past under it, and there were all of these people that were made to look like Hawaiians with, papale or mu'u'u, and signs, and they were angry, and they were yelling, and all of their eyes were closed as though they were blind, right? They're so angry that they're blind. And then the future was this telescope on this mountain, and sort of like the all-powerful eye. So that's just, it's one of those tired colonial tropes, I think, that is still, though, very powerful, that somehow our people are of the past. I was just looking before this at one of those books that's in the book store there, that was a coffee table photo book that I think came out in the 80s, maybe late 70s, called The Hawaiians. And on the book jacket cover, it's like, who are the ancient Hawaiians, and who are the Hawaiians today? And it turns out it's really just the spirit of, aloha and all that kind of stuff. So it's something that we still encounter, right, till today. And for me, this is why Black Panther is so exciting, because it's like you get to see this world where you can imagine what it would have been like if people had been able to maintain their sovereignty and control over their natural resources, and see the development that, when I think about the history of Hawaii, what would it have been like if the U.S. occupation hadn't taken place, and we had continued to hybridize and modernize on our own terms and continue to develop, international relationships. What would it look like today? So it's exciting to me to kind of participate in that vicariously through thinking about that in terms of Black Panther. What would it have been like if Africa had not been colonized and robbed of bodies and natural resources? And so that's exciting to me to think about.
So my next question is kind of going off of that idea of the land being a text for us to kind of dig into, to imagine both our or experience our past, futures, and all of the cycles. The cycles come to us through our relationship with land as well. And I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit about, in your practice as people considering futures, in the work that you do, how land comes into that practice and how land contributes to the imagining of futures here in Hawaii and for those of us in the diaspora and abroad.
Well, I guess for me, I think about how settler colonialism is all about the appropriation of land, that it's all about severing the relationship between the original peoples of a place and the place itself, and our stories about that place and the ways that we understand who we are and our genealogies in relation to our ancestors, who are the winds and rains and mountaintops and volcanoes and all of these beings that are around us. And so we know that settler colonialism is ongoing, that it's not something that happens in the past, it's not an event, it's a structure. And so those mechanisms of envisioning land as property to be exploited are still, of course, ongoing. And we think about all the ways that the futures of lands and waters in Hawaii are still being planned and imagined by folks who are not us. And so I think reestablishing our relationships with ʻāina is absolutely critical. And I think about ways that when we go to places and call out to our ancestors and say the names again of the winds and rains, that they respond to us, and they know that we're here. And as Dr. Keikuni Blaisdell, another really amazing Hawaiian activist, scholar, physician, researcher, talks about, our kupuna are always there. Whether or not we recognize them is another thing. So all we have to do is talk to them and remember that the land, ʻāina, is our kupuna, our kupuna.
It's a hard question, not based on values, but based on like a bloody history of, as a Black person who was born in the States, to feel how my ancestors were both brought over to the States to work, exploited, killed, abused for generations, and living on land that felt very bloody to me, I guess, for lack of a better word. So not knowing exactly how to root, and then also feeling so both far away from a home, but also, how do I say it? James Baldwin said everything better than anyone could. But he talks about the South in particular, which is where I was born, as being, as folks being so related to each other for better or for worse, and that in some ways I feel very of that place. Like I feel like I am from a people from that place, but like hovering over bloody soil in a way. And it has been a struggle to figure out how to reconcile that while knowing and longing for a deep connection to place. And I think some folks have different relationships for different reasons, but I was never able to figure out how to kind of know and love a place where I know when I think about my ancestors coming, they were probably like, where am I? The world has ended. So how do I love a place that was a nightmare for them? Living here and learning here has made it, the question of how we be in relationship to land and place and history is more present and visible to me, and the longing is more acute than I have ever experienced. And I think even in the longing, like trying to reconcile it by developing a relationship with land, with place, with knowing the names of things, with trying to know the medicines of things, and there's still an overwhelming longing, but there's some practice that hadn't been there before. So I don't know, it's kind of a painful question actually to kind of sit with, but it's one I sit with every day to some degree, and I don't have a clear answer. I just hope that my practice makes the answer clear for the next generation of folks that come from my lineage. It's not an easy answer for me.
A bunch of things came to mind. I mean, one, the fact that, you know, my ancestors were tools to work land makes for a very complicated relationship to land in a broad sense. But I also recognize that, you know, that model of land is about land that's owned. So when I move that out of the way, and I think about the land that those same ancestors learned to read and escape through, then I see that there are connections. And those are all encoded in songs, they're encoded in gestures. The African religions, and I can speak directly to Ifa traditions in Nigeria, are incredibly earth-centered, right? I think about when I read Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, there's a scene where they're hunting in the dark, and I thought if they ever made a movie of this, that would be the part where the screen is just black and it's all audio. And it's the scene where a milkman is like learning to hunt from his father. And it's all happening in the dark, and they're listening to the hounds and they're listening to each other. And Morrison like reconnects you to black land in an amazing way. She is always conscious of the earth in her novel. So for me, it's been a vicarious. I was born in San Francisco, urban, right? But when I came back from the East Coast in the 90s, and I went to the edge of the Pacific, and I just looked at the rocks and the sand, and I recognized that on one hand, this was a coast that had never known slavery, but then it had known slavery because any issue of land that you ask a Black American is going to, they have to defer to Native Americans. Like, there's no way you can talk about 40 acres and not think about who you actually owe those 40 acres to, right? So there have to be some negotiation. If like Black people got their 40 acres and a mule, the first thing you'd have to do is find the nearest indigenous tribe and figure out how you can work those 40 acres together. And I'm a super amateur geologist. And the first time my wife took me to the windward side, and I looked at the ko'olau, and I was like, that's not plate tectonics. I was like, that's the edge of a volcano. And I was like, but the ko'olau are big. So I'm like kind of trying to draw the edge, and I was like, that was a really big volcano back in the days. I did a little research and found out there was like a 25-mile landslide some uncountable number of years ago that they can still find off the coast. And that was my introduction to like thinking about this land in particular, and then recognizing that anywhere I walk, there's more than one name for that place, that even street signs have nothing to do with. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's not that many street signs in Hawaii. That was one of my biggest frustrations driving. I'm like, it's like, where's the street signs? And I think there's some subtle efforts to say like, nah, you need to know where you are. If you're gonna get around in this place. You know, they conceded to some major streets, but for the most part, it's like, if you don't know it by navigation and feel and gas stations and, you know what I mean? So for me, like that became the beginning of my relationship to this land, and my practice is just about figuring out how to stack all that up and make some of the cross sections legible to students and things for my own work.
Thinking about the role of creative arts in how you engage with the future, or how you think about the future, talk to your students about the future. What does it mean to have these media to do this? And also, especially David kind of mentioned, thinking about the fact that we have these artists who are able to kind of work within this giant capitalistic blockbuster structure and kind of bring parts of themselves and their creativity to bear in a way that is inspirational for many of us. Marvel also had Thor Ragnarok that was directed by Taika Waititi, who really kind of pushed the bounds there and made sure that there was a presence for Indigenous Pacific voices as well in a Thor movie of all things, right? So I wonder if you folks could talk a little bit about what kinds of spaces creative work opens up for us being able to imagine these futures, but also kind of push the boundary a little bit with some of these settler colonial structures, capitalistic structures that we're functioning under.
The first thing that came to mind was something that Haunani K. Trask wrote about her own writing in both prose and poetry, which was that life is a confluence of creativities, that art is political and politics is art, and she talks about how Hawaiian and Polynesian politics itself, includes creative arts as in the act of governing and politics. So that was just the sort of first thing that came to mind.
The role of art, I think that's what humans do. Whether it's like oration as the means of persuading other people, right, and having high standards of speech, right, or the quality of the fabric that you weave for royalty or your mother or your kid. It's like art is at the foundation, I think, for everything that humans do, because it's the first relationship we have to the world, right? Our senses come in and we figure out our way through that field of senses, and then people begin to tell us stories that help us organize how we feel and perceive the world.
Noelani Burgess, who I get to sit with sometimes, she just helps me become a better person, but we call it facilitation training. She's always if you get her booklet on how to be a good facilitator, the first 10 pages are poems. And she's just and this is how we get into that place with each other, where we're not coming with this is who I am, and I'm gonna take these many things away from here and learn this and then implement it in this way. This is where I get into my tender place. This is where I get into my vulnerable place. This is where I get into the place where I'm able to grow and change and listen. And I think art has always done that for us. Sometimes I think back, I'm the first person who took a drum and they found the rhythm must have been I just figured out another way to express who I am. This is the sound of me. This is what I sound like. And I get to share that with you and sync up with you. The kind of connections that we can feel through artistic expression are like nothing else. The parts we can't quite put words to or make fit into a neat little box, that's where we're alive. All of that coloring outside the lines is our life, is our spontaneity, is our creativity. So art has deeply inspired that for me. When I talk about James Baldwin, which I do all the time, I feel he, sometimes you read his sentences and go on for a page. You're can you do that? But you get lost in it. And you start to feel oh, this is what my heart could feel like if I were free. This is what it feels like when I'm free. You get lost inside the sentences and the textures and the moods and the swings of it all. And you forget to be so rigid about who you are. And that's really the space to which you can change and also get a taste of where it is we're trying to go. With all of the work around freedom that we do, writing, teaching, organizing, you can't forget to always dip back into and get a taste of where it is you're trying to go. When I look at that piece of Marvin Gaye and he's doing that thing that Marvin Gaye does, I'm yes, that feeling. I could go through my whole day and week and not have that feeling. Do you know what I mean? Because of how rigid our lives are. And that feeling is my birthright. That owl feeling, that's your birthright too. Do you know what I mean? So art gives us the ability to feel that, to go there, and to stretch beyond what we're told we're supposed to be. That's all.
Prentice's mic drop moment. We have a couple more minutes before we're going to open it up for Q&A with the audience. But I wanted to talk with you folks a little bit about, we're thinking about Black Panther. One of the interesting things in the way it kind of has been marketed is, imagine there's a place in Africa that was not colonized, that's the most technologically advanced place on earth. The film itself spends a lot of time kind of imagining all of these cool gadgets and cool armor and kind of militarized things that are cool. And the military and the CIA and all those things actually factor into the story quite a lot. So I'm wondering what you folks might be able to say to the ways that our futures, even as we're trying to kind of liberate ourselves and our imaginations, sometimes also get funneled into these technological spaces that can be very oppressive. We live in the era of the Black Mirror, where we're thinking about how technology intervenes in our life. Like David said, they're tracking us everywhere we go all the time. How do we kind of reconcile that as we think about the future, not necessarily as a dystopian future, but as a source and something that we can look forward to as a space for liberation for our peoples?
The hypercritic in me is concerned about the Western model of progress. Because if that part of Africa were never colonized, then why would they make these decisions, to urbanize, for example? So I think about the Dogon people in Mali, who I don't know why they're up against that cliff, but clearly they were trying to get away from enough people where they live in the most inhospitable corner of Mali, but they have some of the deepest culture that you could ever ask for. And they rock these tall, headdresses that are 9 feet tall, and they dance with them. I'm like, that's pretty advanced, right? I'm ready for the gadgets. You know what I mean? I'm ready for nanotech armor, the whole deal. I mean, I'm a comics nerd, I'm with that. But when the fact that violence still solves the problem is still an issue. You know what I mean? And that I think when you take your little kids to see it, make sure that, is violence really the solution? Is that what an uncolonized country would be about if they have the most valuable resource on the planet? And I can't help but look at, the fact that all the rare earth that goes to our cell phones comes out of Africa, right? So it's there's aspects of the Black Panther spectacle that are actually distracting us from the reality of what's actually happening, which is children are pulling I can never say it right, molybdenum, or whatever. It's a super rare earth metal. It's found in small parts of China, bits of Mongolia, and mostly in the Congo. Right? And it's the metal that makes our cell phones work. It's vibranium. It's unobtainium, right? It's whether you want to think about Avatar, it's that too. Right? So if we want to talk about the repetition and the cycles, right? Why are we still dealing with these narratives of the one resource that makes other people's shit work better?
Advancement to me is only makes sense inside of understanding where it is we're trying to go. So I think we think about advancement as some neutral thing. Right. So advanced. But if we really look closely, it's inside of a destination that we may or may not want to go to. I don't. So I think it's important for us to kind of look at what that means. And then this question around technologies, I just think about technologies is a really broad term. We think about technologies as our relationships, kind of these computerized or whatever. But there are all these technologies that our peoples have used for many years, ways of doing things. And I'm just interested in what technologies we privilege over others. But I think about our attention as one of the last places where we're sort of facing colonization, and how our attention itself is being colonized. We're just, I gotta scroll through this thing, I gotta see it, and this ad, and oh, hi, how you doing? I mean, I do this, I'm guilty of this. But our attention is even being pulled away and monetized, and we're not seeing it as that.
Well, I'm really excited to see Black Panther and have, am concerned about the ways that it continues to make us think about a certain kind of technology as technology with a capital T, and the militarization aspect of it. Not being able to envision a future beyond the state or beyond capitalism, those things are still very much present in the world of Black Panther. So one of the things that I think is really exciting about Indigenous Futurisms is the reclaiming of that word, technology, and the ways that creatives in this field of Indigenous Futurisms are trying to unsettle what we assume about technology. So just read you a quick quote from Luke Cornum, who talks about intentionality of emerging Indigenous futurisms to overcome the settler death drive. And so Cornum writes, instead, Indigenous futurisms imagine different ways of relating to notions of progress and civilizations. Advanced technologies should foster and improve human relationships with the non-human world. In many Indigenous science fiction tales of the futures, technology is presented as in dialogue with long traditions of the past rather than representing the past's overcoming. Indigenous futurism does not care for speed so much as sustainability, not so much for progress as balance, not so much power but relation. And it makes me think about some really amazing Kanaka thinkers that inspire me. So I was recently reading a piece by Maile Arvin, who's an Indigenous feminist, Kanaka writer, who talks about how Hawaiian pronouns, the way that we have multiple pronouns for different situations, kako, kaua, lako, laua, they're basically like inclusive, exclusive, them. So there's not only a single universalizing we, there are many ways to say we that depend on the context. That itself is a technology, right? Our ways of understanding how to relate to one another and how to talk about our relationships is a technology. Or I think about a good friend of mine, Hano Naehu, who's a Kia'iloko, a fish pond caretaker at Keawanui on Moloka'i, who when he greets groups that first come to the place, he says, this is a 500-year-old fish pond that we've restored, welcome to the future. And that it's a technology of knowing how to stack rocks in such a way that enhances the capability of the natural world. And there's a reason why I think our kupuna said, that the stones are enough for us, because they had mastered being able to work with stones to be able to produce food at many, many times the natural productivity of the ecosystems that they lived in without harming them, actually contributing to the richness of them. So that, I think, needs to be recognized as technology.
So we started off tonight with me asking each of you what is futurism, what is the future? And before we open it up for questions from our audience, I want to ask you, why should we be thinking about Black futures and Hawaiʻi futures together?
We exist in a time where, due to our geographic isolation and the segregation that media does to us, we don't think that a kid getting shot on a street corner by a cop has anything to do with the rape and poisoning of the land, when it's actually all the same process. But the problem becomes, like, how do you articulate that enough so that a young person understands that? So you can't just throw the slogan at them and say it's all just capitalism, it's all just colonialism. Like, how do we find the nuances that allow young people to really understand, right? So if you are in Kapolei and that Black kid comes into your class and they're a junior and you call them a nigger, right? Or you work for Hawaiian Airlines and someone puts a noose on your locker, or you're at Queens, and the downside of white supremacy is totally active here, and it's still being enacted against Black people. There's something really deep that contemporary African Americans and contemporary Hawaiians we're all struggling could learn from each other. It has to do with comparing senses of loss. It has to do with figuring out, oh, the way you guys still do it, yeah, my folks used to do that too. So it's not about appropriation, you know what I mean? But it's about, how do we develop the art to begin making those connections? How do we envision these futures for each other? You know what I mean? Because I feel, in a way, like obligated to think about the future of this place since I live here. You know, and that has to do with me also bringing everything that I can to the people that I know.
It's really important for us to first recognize that we've been creating familial ties for a long time now, both in Hawaii and outside of Hawaii. So there's this really beautiful book by a Hawaiian historian named David Chang, who that's called The World and All the Things Upon It, who talks about how members of the Hawaiian and African diaspora were meeting on the U.S. continent in that settler colonial context and creating familial ties there. So I think, first of all, it's just important for us to not just talk about us as sort of separate peoples, beyond that, I think, contemporary issues, I feel like there are so many ways that we can, like I'm thinking, for example, about incarceration. This is such an important issue that a lot of African American and other people of color organizing around an abolitionist framework have articulated some really amazing things that I think has not made it as much into Hawaiian analyses of incarceration as it could. And so I would be, I think that's one area for a lot more potential discussion and collaboration around. Some of the, sort of, again, that going back to the expanding our imaginations, one of the conversations that I remember from this symposium called Futures Rooted in Wonder, that was at the university a few years ago, was Nisi Shaw was talking about how when you come from a people who have experienced the kind of violence that has disconnected you from your ancestral traditions in such a violent way, that sometimes you have to be more fanciful about, creating. And I think that gave some of us, who are Kanaka, just a little bit more permission to think about being fanciful with our own traditions, which, sometimes they're the other side of the way that we've been sort of colonized, right, is to be sort of the authenticity police about our traditions. And so, I think that's really cool to learn from and be inspired by. And I've seen that inspire the work of some amazing Hawaiian creative writers as well.
This is fun because I feel like we're doing this panel and it feels like we're sitting in a bunch of questions we don't have the answers to. And this is nice. This feels obviously important, and I think the articulation is just the reveal. I think for all these reasons, sort of the conditions we're in, the things that we've lost, and the things that we have yet to teach each other, I think the fact that in some bodies we are the same person. So there's just all of these ways that we are connected and have these familial ties. I also feel like, I'll just say, like, backing up to a year ago when the inauguration situation that happened and the month of things that came, well, actually the year that followed, of legislation, and also I think recently here and the I don't know how we talk about this, the scare, that we call that a scare, that thing that happened, and how I think for a lot of us it's just like keep awakening to how militarized Hawaii is, and what that means for the land, for the people, and all of that to be kind of positioned this way. But all of that to say that I think this last year has kind of revealed the places where we all felt like, oh, I'm over here doing this thing, you're over here doing this thing. If we don't see our connections, there's someone that does. There's a whole group of people that see the places where we are connected and are targeting us in all of these places. So I think it's imperative for us and strategic for us to kind of understand the relationships between our histories and our futures. The last thing I want to say is that I think it's, we haven't been so practiced at figuring out how to be in our dignity and our history and our legacies and in connection with each other. So much about how colonization has played out, I mean, we've had to forget, or we've, I don't mean Black folks and Hawaiian folks in particular, but I think different groups have had moments where they've betrayed each other or felt like they had to give something up in order to care about each other. And I think it's a challenge, and one that we have to rise to the occasion of, to figure out how to be in our dignity and our truth and our own histories, and also deeply care about and envision a future for each other. I don't think we know how to do that easily, and I feel like it's very, very critical and an important practice for us to try to figure it out. So.
I want to mahalo our panel. Mahalo. Thank you.